The screen door creaked in the evening breeze as Martha Henderson wiped flour from her hands on her apron. The smell of pot roast filled the farmhouse kitchen, mixing with the scent of fresh-baked cornbread cooling on the windowsill. Outside, the Iowa cornfields stretched endlessly under the amber glow of the setting sun. "Dinner's almost ready, come inside," Martha called out, her voice carrying across the 40-acre property where her husband Tom was finishing the evening chores in the barn. It was October 15th, 1987, a Tuesday that started like any other on the Henderson farm, located 12 miles outside the small town of Millbrook, population 847. Martha had spent the afternoon preparing Tom's favorite meal, humming along to the radio while their two children, Sarah, 14, and little Bobby, 8, played in the backyard. The Henderson family had lived on this land for 3 generations. Tom's grandfather had built the white 2-story farmhouse in 1923, and every Henderson since had worked these same fields, raised their children in these same rooms, and gathered around the same oak dining table that Martha was now setting with her grandmother's china. But this Tuesday evening would be different. This would be the last time Martha Henderson would ever call her family to dinner. At exactly 6:47 p.m., according to the kitchen clock that would later be found stopped at that precise moment, something happened on the Henderson farm. Something that would baffle investigators, haunt the community, and remain unsolved for 36 years. The pot roast burned in the oven, the cornbread grew cold on the windowsill, and the Henderson family simply vanished. No signs of struggle, no ransom notes, no witnesses. 4 people who had lived their entire lives in this quiet corner of Iowa just disappeared. The dining table remained set for 4, with steam still rising from the mashed potatoes when Sheriff Bill Crawford arrived the next morning after concerned neighbors reported seeing the barn doors wide open and the cows wandering loose in the pasture. Tom's work boots sat neatly by the back door. Martha's purse hung on its usual hook. Sarah's homework lay half-finished on the kitchen counter, her pencil still resting in the margin where she'd been working on algebra problems. Bobby's toy trucks were scattered across the living room floor, as if he'd been called away mid-game. The only unusual detail was the kitchen clock, its hands frozen at 6:47 p.m., though the power had never gone out. For 36 years, the Henderson farmhouse stood empty. The bank eventually took possession, but no one wanted to buy the property. Local real estate agents whispered about the cursed farm, and even the bravest teenagers avoided it on Halloween dares. The cornfields grew wild. The white paint peeled from the farmhouse walls. Windows cracked from winter storms, and ivy crept up the front porch. Columns. Nature slowly began to reclaim what the Henderson family had left behind. But the mystery never died. Sheriff Crawford, now retired, still kept the case file on his desk. Martha's sister, Helen, never stopped believing they'd come home. And every October 15th someone would leave fresh flowers by the mailbox that still bore the Henderson name. Then, on a cold morning in November 2023, 36 years and 1 month after the family vanished, a stranger appeared at the Henderson farm. His name was David Chen, a 34-year-old documentary filmmaker from Chicago who had purchased the property site unseen at a county auction. David specialized in abandoned places, creating atmospheric films about forgotten corners of America. The Henderson farm, with its tragic history and photogenic decay, seemed perfect for his next project. David had no idea that his arrival would finally unlock the secret of what happened on that October evening in 1987. As his rental car crunched up the gravel driveway, David felt the weight of the place immediately. The farmhouse loomed before him, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring across the overgrown fields. The barn leaned precariously to one side, its red paint faded to rust brown, but it was the silence that struck him most. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath around the Henderson property. David parked near the front porch and stepped out, his camera, equipment heavy in his hands. He'd researched the case extensively, reading every newspaper article and police report he could find. The story had captivated him not just for its mystery, but for its human element. A family going about their normal evening routine, then simply ceasing to exist. As he approached the front door, David noticed something that made him pause. The door was slightly ajar, though the real estate agent had assured him the house had been sealed for decades. He pushed it open slowly, and the hinges groaned in protest. The smell hit him first. Not the musty odor of abandonment he'd expected, but something else. Something that made his skin crawl and his heart race. It smelled like dinner cooking. David stood frozen in the doorway, his camera bag slipping from his shoulder. The smell was impossible. Pot roast and cornbread, exactly as the police reports had described from that October evening in 1987. His rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe squatters had been using the house. Maybe his imagination was playing tricks after reading too many case files. But as he stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight, David realized the smell wasn't the only impossibility. The house was exactly as the Henderson family had left it 36 years ago. The dining table still held 4 place settings, the china plates gleaming as if they'd just been washed. A serving bowl sat in the center, filled with what looked like fresh mashed potatoes, steam rising lazily in the afternoon light filtering through dusty windows. David's hands trembled as he pulled out his camera. This had to be some kind of elaborate hoax. Someone was playing a sick joke, recreating the scene for reasons he couldn't fathom. But as he moved through the house, documenting everything, the details became too perfect, too authentic. In the living room, toy trucks were scattered across the hardwood floor in the exact positions described in the police photographs. A small red fire engine lay on its side near the couch. Its tiny ladder extended as if 8-year-old Bobby Henderson had been in the middle of an imaginary rescue when something interrupted his play. The kitchen told the most chilling story. The oven door hung open, revealing a pot roast that should have been charcoal after 36 years, but instead looked perfectly cooked, its juices still bubbling. Cornbread sat cooling on the heu windowsill, golden brown and fragrant, and there on the wall above the sink hung the kitchen clock. Its hands pointed to 6:47 p.m., just as they had when Sheriff Crawford first entered the house in 1987. But now, the second hand was moving. David watched in horror as it swept around the clock face in perfect rhythm, marking time that should have stopped decades ago. He fumbled for his phone to record this impossibility, but the screen remained black. Dead battery, though he'd charged it fully that morning. A sound from upstairs made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above his head. "Hello?" David called out, his voice cracking. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. David grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, his documentary instincts warring with pure terror. He had to investigate. This was the story of a lifetime, if he lived to tell it. The wooden stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed toward the second floor. Family photographs lined the stairway wall, Tom and Martha on their wedding day, Sarah's school pictures showing the progression from gap-toothed kindergartner to awkward teenager, Bobby's Little League team photo. But in every picture, the faces seemed to be watching him. At the top of the stairs, David found himself in a narrow hallway with 4 doors, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and what appeared to be a storage closet. All the doors stood open except one, the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The footsteps had come from behind that closed door. David approached slowly, the knife clutched in his sweaty palm. He pressed his ear against the wood and heard something that made his blood run cold. Humming. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, humming a tune he didn't recognize. "Martha," he whispered, though he knew it was impossible. The humming stopped. David's hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, and the door swung open to reveal the master bedroom, frozen in time like the rest of the house. A wedding dress hung in the open closet, still white despite the decades. Work clothes lay folded on a chair. The bed was made with military precision, its quilt pulled tight. But the room was empty. David stepped inside, scanning every corner. No one could have been in here. There was nowhere to hide. Yet he'd heard the humming as clearly as his own heartbeat. A photograph on the nightstand caught his attention. Tom and Martha Henderson on their 10th wedding anniversary, according to the inscription. They looked happy, content with their simple farm life. Martha's smile was radiant, her eyes bright with love and hope for the future. A future that had been stolen from them on a Tuesday evening in October. David picked up the photograph, studying Martha's face. She'd been 34 when she vanished, exactly his age now. In the picture, she wore the same apron he'd seen described in the police reports, the one with tiny blue flowers that she'd been wearing when she called her family to dinner for the last time. Behind him, a floorboard creaked. David spun around, but the doorway remained empty. Yet he could swear he felt a presence, as if someone was standing just out of sight, watching him with invisible eyes. "I'm here to help," he said aloud, feeling foolish but desperate to communicate with whatever force had preserved this house in its impossible state. "I want to tell your story. I want people to know what happened to your family." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. David's breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. The photograph in his hands grew ice cold, and frost began to form on the glass covering Martha's smiling face. Then, from somewhere in the house below, came the sound that would haunt David Chen for the rest of his life. A woman's voice, clear and strong, calling out across the decades, "Dinner's almost ready. Come." Inside, David dropped the photograph and it shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, but it was immediately swallowed by an even more impossible noise, the slam of the screen door downstairs, followed by heavy footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. Someone had just entered the house. David's mind reeled as he tried to process what was happening. The voice calling about dinner had been identical to the one described by neighbors in 1987. Martha Henderson's voice with its slight Iowa accent and maternal warmth. But Martha Henderson had been missing for 36 years. The footsteps below moved with purpose, accompanied by the familiar sounds of a family gathering for dinner, chairs scraping against the floor, the clink of silverware, the soft murmur of conversation too distant to understand. David crept to the top of the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the banister spindles he could see into the kitchen where warm light now glowed, though he was certain the electricity had been disconnected decades ago. Shadows moved across the walls, human shapes going about the routine of a family meal. "This isn't possible," David whispered to himself, but the evidence of his senses couldn't be denied. Somehow, impossibly, the Henderson family was downstairs having dinner. He descended the stairs one careful step at a time, the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. With each step, the sounds became clearer. A man's deep voice, Tom Henderson, asking about someone's day at school. A teenage girl, Sarah, complaining about a math test. A young boy, Bobby, chattering excitedly about something he'd found in the barn. Normal family conversation, the kind that had filled this house every evening until October 15th, 1987. David reached the bottom of the stairs and peered around the corner into the kitchen. What he saw defied every law of physics and reason he'd ever known. The Henderson family sat around their dining table, exactly as they had 36 years ago. Tom, a tall man with calloused hands and kind eyes, carved the pot roast with practiced efficiency. Martha bustled between the table and the stove, her blue-flowered apron tied around her waist, her brown hair pinned back in the style of the 1980s. Sarah sat with the sullen posture of a teenager, picking at her food while sneaking glances at a magazine hidden in her lap. Bobby bounced in his chair, his face animated as he told his family about the baby owl he'd discovered in the barn loft. They looked exactly as they had in the family photographs, unchanged by the passage of time. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that made David's skin crawl even as he stood transfixed. They cast no shadows. The warm kitchen light illuminated every detail of the room, but the Henderson family existed without casting a single shadow on the walls or floor. They were there, solid and real, yet somehow not entirely present in the physical world. "The owl was just sitting there," Bobby was saying, his 8-year-old voice bright with wonder. "It looked right at me with these huge yellow eyes, like it was trying to tell me something important." "That's nice, honey," Martha replied, setting a basket of cornbread on the table. "But you need to be careful in the barn. Some of those old boards are loose." Tom nodded in agreement. "I've been meaning to fix that section near the loft. Maybe this weekend we can work on it together, Bobby." The conversation was so normal, so achingly ordinary, that David felt tears spring to his eyes. This was what had been stolen from the Henderson family. Not just their lives, but all the small moments that make up a life. All the dinners they'd never share, the conversations they'd never have, the memories they'd never make. David stepped into the kitchen, and immediately the temperature plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs as the family continued their meal, apparently unaware of his presence. "Excuse me," David said softly. No response. The Hendersons continued eating and talking as if he didn't exist. David moved closer to the table, studying their faces. Up close, he could see that while they appeared solid, there was a translucent quality to their skin, as if they were projected images rather than flesh and blood. "Can you hear me?" he asked, louder. This time, Martha paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. For a moment, her eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the dining room, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. "Did you hear something?" she asked Tom. Tom looked up from his plate, listening. "Just the wind, I think. Storm's supposed to move in tonight." But David could see that Martha wasn't convinced. Her maternal instincts, honed by years of raising children, sensed something amiss. She set down her fork and turned toward the kitchen window, her brow furrowed with concern. "Tom," she said slowly, "what time is it?" Tom glanced at the kitchen clock, and his face went pale. "That can't be right. The clock says 6:47, but we've been eating for at least 20 minutes. Sarah looked up from her magazine, suddenly alert. "Mom, why is it so cold in here all of a sudden?" Bobby stopped chattering about the owl and hugged his arms around his small body. "I'm scared," he whispered. The family's confusion was growing, and with it, the temperature in the room continued to drop. Frost began forming on the windows, and their breath became visible in the frigid air. Martha stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Something's very wrong." That's when she saw David. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Martha's face went white with terror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, she began to fade, her form becoming more translucent with each passing second. "Martha, what is it?" Tom asked, but he too was beginning to fade. "I can see through you, Mom," Sarah cried out, her teenage bravado cracking into childlike fear. Bobby reached for his mother's hand, but his fingers passed right through her dissolving form. "Mommy!" he screamed. The Henderson family was disappearing before David's eyes, their forms becoming wisps of vapor that swirled around the kitchen, before dissipating entirely. Within seconds, the dining room was empty again, the plates and food vanishing along with the family. The kitchen clock stopped ticking. Its hands once again pointed to 6:47 p.m. David stood alone in the sudden silence, his heart pounding and his mind struggling to process what he'd witnessed. The house had returned to its abandoned state, dusty, cold, and filled with the musty smell of decades-old decay. But on the dining room table, one thing remained. A single piece of cornbread still warm to the touch. David stared at the cornbread for a full minute, afraid to touch it, afraid it might disappear like everything else. The golden crust still radiated warmth, and when he finally worked up the courage to pick it up, it felt real, solid and substantial in his trembling hands. He took a small bite. It tasted exactly like his grandmother's cornbread, sweet and crumbly with just a hint of honey. Real food, not some ghostly apparition. But how is that possible? David pulled out his notebook and began documenting everything he'd witnessed, writing frantically before the details could fade from his memory. The shadowless family, the impossible preservation of the house, the way Martha had seen him at the end, her eyes wide with recognition and terror. As he wrote, a theory began forming in his mind. What if the Henderson family hadn't simply vanished? What if they'd become trapped somehow, doomed to repeat that final evening over and over again for 36 years? The thought sent chills down his spine, but it was the only explanation that made sense of what he'd witnessed. Somehow, the family was caught in a temporal loop, reliving their last dinner together night after night, unaware that decades had passed. But why had they been able to see him? And why had his presence caused them to fade away? David spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the house, searching for clues that might explain the supernatural preservation of the scene. In Tom's study, he found farming journals dating back to the 1980s, the last entry made on October 15, 1987, the day of the disappearance. The entry was brief, but troubling. "Strange lights in the north field again last night. Third time this week. Cattle are spooked. Martha thinks we should call the sheriff, but what would we tell him? That we're seeing things that can't be explained? Strange lights." David made a note and continued, searching. In Sarah's bedroom, he found her diary hidden beneath the mattress. The final entry, also dated October 15, 1987, was written in the careful cursive of a 14-year-old. Something weird is happening on the farm. Bobby says he saw people in the cornfield yesterday, but when Dad went to check, there was nobody there. Just circles in the corn where it looked like something heavy had landed. Mom and Dad are trying to act normal, but I can tell they're scared. I'm scared. 2. What if those stories about the Hartwell farm are true? What if something bad is going to happen to us too? The Hartwell farm. David had never heard that name in connection with the Henderson case. He made another note to research it. In Bobby's room, he found something even more disturbing. Crayon drawings scattered across the small desk, all depicting the same scene. A farmhouse surrounded by bright lights, with stick figures of a family standing in the yard. But in every drawing, the stick figures had no faces. David photographed everything, building a case file that would have made Sheriff Crawford proud. But as the afternoon wore on and shadows began lengthening across the farmhouse floors, he realized he faced a crucial decision. Should he stay for another evening? Would the family appear again at 6:47 p.m.? The rational part of his mind screamed at him to leave, to get as far away from this impossible place as possible. But the filmmaker in him, the part that had driven him to document forgotten stories, knew he couldn't walk away. Not when he was on the verge of solving one of Iowa's greatest mysteries. As evening approached, David set up his camera equipment in the kitchen, positioning multiple angles to capture whatever might happen. His phone still wouldn't work, but his cameras functioned normally, their batteries showing full charges, despite the electronic interference he'd experienced earlier. At 6:30 p.m., David took his position in the living room, where he could observe the kitchen while remaining hidden behind the doorway. The house felt different as the appointed time approached, charged with energy, like the air before a thunderstorm. At 6:45 p.m., the temperature began to drop. At 6:46 p.m., David heard the screen door creak open. At exactly 6:47 p.m., Martha Henderson's voice rang out across the decades. "Dinner's almost ready, come inside." But this time, David was ready. This time, he would get answers. The family materialized in the kitchen just as they had before, taking their places around the dining table with the same conversations, the same gestures, the same shadowless existence. David watched through his camera viewfinder, recording every detail. But instead of simply observing, he stepped into the kitchen immediately, before the family could become fully settled in their routine. "Martha," he said firmly, "you need to listen to me." Martha looked up from serving the pot roast, her eyes focusing on David with the same confusion as before. But this time he didn't let her fear take over. "My name is David Chen," he continued. "The year is 2023. You and your family disappeared on October 15th, 1987. You've been trapped here for 36 years. The family froze, their forks halfway to their mouths. Tom's face went pale, and Sarah's magazine slipped from her trembling hands. "That's impossible," Tom said slowly. "It's 1987. We just sat down for dinner." "Look at the clock," David urged. "It's been 6:47 p.m. for 36 years. You're caught in some kind of loop, reliving this same evening over and over." Bobby began to cry, the sound heartbreaking in its innocence. "I want to go home," he sobbed. "You are home," Martha said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was beginning to remember something. David could see it in her eyes. "We are home, aren't we, Tom?" Tom stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "The lights," he whispered. "I remember the lights in the field. They were so bright, and then what?" David pressed. "I don't know," Tom said, his voice breaking. "I can't remember what happened after the lights." The family was beginning to fade again, their forms becoming translucent as the truth of their situation sank in. But David wasn't going to let them disappear without answers. "Fight it," he urged. "Don't let go. Tell me about the lights. Tell me what really happened that night." Martha reached for her husband's hand, and for a moment their fingers seemed to solidify, becoming real again. "The lights came down from the sky," she said, her voice growing stronger. "They surrounded the house. We tried to run, but what?" David asked. Sarah spoke up, her teenage voice trembling with remembered terror. "They weren't from here," she whispered. "The things in the lights, they weren't human." The kitchen fell into an eerie silence as Sarah's words hung in the air. David felt his blood turn to ice, but he forced himself to stay focused. This was the breakthrough he'd been hoping for. The family was finally remembering what had happened to them. "Tell me about the things in the lights," David said gently, keeping his voice calm despite the terror clawing at his chest. "What did they look like?" Sarah's form flickered like a candle flame in the wind, but she fought to maintain her presence. "They were tall," she whispered. "Taller than Dad, but thin. So thin they looked like they might break. And their eyes were black," Bobby finished, his small voice barely audible, like holes in their faces. They didn't blink. Tom's face was ashen as the memories came flooding back. "They came to the door first," he said slowly. "3 of them. They didn't knock, just stood there waiting. When I opened the door, they didn't speak, but somehow I knew what they wanted." "What did they want?" David asked, though he dreaded the answer. Martha's voice was hollow when she replied, "Us. They wanted us." The temperature in the kitchen plummeted even further. Frost began forming on the windows again, and David's breath came out in thick white puffs. But the family seemed to be growing more solid, more present as they shared their terrible secret. "I tried to slam the door," Tom continued, "but it wouldn't close. It was like there was an invisible force holding it open. Then the lights got brighter, so bright I couldn't see anything else. We all came running when we heard Dad shouting," Sarah added. "But when we got to the kitchen, the whole house was filled with that light. It was coming through the walls, through the ceiling, everywhere." Bobby climbed onto his mother's lap, seeking comfort even in their ghostly state. "They talked to us without moving their mouths," he said. "Inside our heads. They said they needed to study us." David's hands shook as he continued recording. This was beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd started investigating the Henderson disappearance. "Study you for what?" "They said our kind was dying out," Martha replied, her maternal instincts still strong even in death. "That they needed to understand how we lived, how we loved, how we made families. They said they would preserve us." "Preserve you how?" Tom's laugh was bitter and broken. "Like this, trapped in our last moment of happiness, playing it over and over for their entertainment. They said it was a kindness that we would never have to experience pain or loss or death." "But we're already dead, aren't we?" Sarah asked, looking directly at David. "That's why you can see through us. That's why nothing ever changes." David nodded slowly, his heart breaking for this family trapped between life and death. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." "How long?" Martha asked. "How long have we been here?" 36 years, David replied. "Your disappearance became one of Iowa's most famous unsolved cases. People never stopped looking for you, never stopped hoping you'd come home." Tears streamed down Martha's translucent cheeks. "Our families, our parents, do they know what happened to us?" David shook his head. No one knew. Until now. The family began to fade again, but this time it felt different. Not like they were being pulled away, but like they were choosing to let go. "Wait," David called out. "Don't go yet, I need to know more. Are there others? Other families like you?" Tom's voice was growing distant. "The Hartwells, the Kowalskis, the Brennans, all the farms in this area where people vanished without a trace. We're all here, David. All of us trapped in our final moments. Where are they? Where are the beings that did this to you?" "Still here," Martha said, her form now barely visible. "Still watching, still studying. They never left." The family was almost gone now, their voices like whispers on the wind. "Help us," Sarah pleaded. "Find a way to set us free. Tell our story," Bobby added. "Tell people what really happened." And then they were gone, leaving David alone in the cold, empty kitchen, with only the lingering scent of pot roast and the weight of an impossible truth. David stood in the silence for a long moment, processing what he'd learned. The Henderson family hadn't simply vanished. They'd been abducted by beings from another world, preserved like specimens in a cosmic zoo. And according to Tom, they weren't the only ones. The Hartwells, the Kowalskis, the Brennans. How many other families had suffered the same fate? David spent the next hour researching on his laptop, using the farmhouse's mysteriously restored internet connection. What he found chilled him to the bone. The Hartwell family had disappeared from their farm just 5 miles away in 1983. Parents, 2 children, and a grandmother all vanished during Sunday dinner. The case had baffled investigators with no signs of struggle and no evidence of foul play. The Kowalskis had vanished in 1979, leaving behind a half-finished game of Monopoly and a pot of coffee still brewing on the stove. The Brennans had disappeared in 1991, their car still in the driveway, their front door standing wide open, all within a 20-mile radius of the Henderson farm, all during family gatherings or meals, all without a trace. David plotted the locations on a map and felt his blood run cold. The farms formed a perfect circle around a patch of land that, according to county records, had never been owned by anyone. It was simply listed as undeveloped territory, with no legal description or survey markers. That had to be where they were. The beings that had taken these families, that were still watching and studying their preserved victims. As David prepared to leave the farmhouse, planning to investigate the mysterious central location, he heard something that made him freeze. A car engine approaching on the gravel road. David peered through the kitchen window and saw headlights cutting through the darkness. A black sedan was pulling into the Henderson driveway, moving slowly and deliberately. The car stopped near the front porch, and David watched in growing terror as three figures emerged. They were tall and impossibly thin, just as the Henderson family had described. In the moonlight, David could see their pale, elongated faces and the dark hollows where their eyes should be. They moved with fluid grace toward the farmhouse, and David realized with mounting horror that they knew he was there. They'd been watching him all along, waiting to see what he would do with the knowledge he'd gained. David grabbed his camera equipment and ran for the back door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed, as if welded shut. He tried. The windows. Same result. Every exit was blocked by some invisible force. He was trapped, just like the Henderson family had been 36 years ago. The front door opened with a soft creak, and David heard footsteps crossing the threshold. Slow, measured steps that seemed to echo with otherworldly purpose. David retreated to the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The beings were in the house now, and he could feel their presence like a cold weight pressing down on his soul. A voice spoke inside his head, emotionless and alien. "You have seen too much, David Chen. You have disturbed our subjects. This cannot be permitted." "I won't tell anyone," David lied, backing against the kitchen counter. "I'll forget everything I saw here." "Deception," the voice replied. "We can taste your intentions. You wish to expose us to free our collection. This is not acceptable." The three beings appeared in the kitchen doorway, their dark eyes fixed on David with predatory intensity. Up close, they were even more terrifying. Their skin was translucent, showing the dark network of veins beneath, and their fingers were too long, ending in points that looked sharp enough to cut glass. "You will join our study," the voice continued. "Your final moment will be preserved for analysis. We are curious about the emotion you call determination. It is rare among your species." David felt the same paralyzing light that had trapped the Henderson family, beginning to fill the room. But unlike the farm families who had been caught off guard, David knew what was coming. He had one chance. David's hand closed around the kitchen knife he'd dropped earlier, and with a desperate surge of adrenaline, he lunged forward. The blade passed harmlessly through the nearest being, but the action seemed to surprise them. The paralyzing light flickered for just a moment. That moment was all David needed. He dove through the kitchen window, glass, exploding around him as he crashed into the farmyard. Pain shot through his arms and legs where the shards cut him, but he ignored it and ran toward his car. Behind him, he heard no pursuit, no footsteps, no shouts, no sounds of the beings following. But he could feel their presence like ice water in his veins, and he knew they were coming for him in ways that defied physical laws. David's hands shook as he fumbled with his car keys. The engine turned over on the third try, and he gunned it down the gravel driveway, his headlights cutting through the darkness. In his rearview mirror, he could see the farmhouse glowing with that same otherworldly light that had trapped the Henderson family. But he'd escaped. Somehow, impossibly, he'd gotten away. David drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the Henderson farm. But even as the miles passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the beings were still with him, watching from just beyond the edge of perception. He stopped at a 24-hour diner in Cedar Rapids and tried to process what had happened. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, poured him coffee with hands that trembled slightly. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey," she said with genuine concern. David almost laughed at the irony. "Something like that," he replied. As he sat in the fluorescent-lit diner, surrounded by the mundane reality of late-night truckers and insomniacs, David began to doubt his own sanity. Had he really witnessed a family of ghosts reliving their final dinner? Had he actually encountered alien beings who collected human families like specimens? But then he looked at his camera, and his blood ran cold. The memory card was empty. Every photo, every video he'd taken at the farmhouse, gone, erased as if they'd never existed, all except one. A single image remained, the photograph of Tom and Martha Henderson on their anniversary, the one he'd picked up in the master bedroom. But the photo had changed. Instead of showing the happy couple alone, it now included 3 tall, dark figures standing behind them. The beings had been watching the Henderson family long before that final night. They'd been studying them, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. David stared at the impossible photograph and realized that his escape hadn't been luck or skill. The beings had let him go. They wanted him to carry this knowledge, this terror, this burden of truth that no one would ever believe. But David Chen had spent his career telling stories that others thought were impossible. He would find a way to expose these creatures, to free the families they'd trapped, even if it cost him everything. The waitress refilled his coffee cup. "You sure you're okay, honey? You look like you're planning something dangerous." David looked up at her kind, weathered face and made a decision that would change everything. "What do you know about the missing families around here?" he asked. "The ones who vanished from their farms over the years?" The waitress glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Why do you want to know about that?" "Because I think I know what happened to them." The woman's eyes widened. "You're that documentary filmmaker, aren't you? The one who's been asking questions around town?" David nodded. "I am, and I need your help." The waitress, her name tag read, Dolores, sat down across from him. "My sister was friends with Martha Henderson," she said quietly. "When the family disappeared, it nearly destroyed our whole community. People were afraid to let their children play outside. Families started moving away." "What if I told you they're still alive?" David asked. "Trapped but alive." Dolores studied his face for a long moment. "I'd say you're either crazy or you've stumbled onto something that powerful people don't want exposed." "Which do you think it is?" "Honey, I've lived in Iowa my whole life. I've seen things that can't be explained, heard stories that would make your hair stand on end. If you say those families are still alive, I believe you." David felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone who might listen, someone who might help. "I need to go back," he said, "to the center of where all the disappearances happened. But I can't do it alone." Dolores was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone. "I know some people," she said. "People who've been waiting 36 years for answers. People who won't be scared off by impossible stories." As Dolores made her calls, David stared out the diner window at the dark Iowa landscape. Somewhere out there, the Henderson family and countless others were trapped in their final moments, reliving their last dinners while alien beings studied their preserved emotions. But not for much longer. David Chen had a story to tell, and this time, he was going to make sure the whole world listened. The first person Dolores called was Sheriff Crawford's son, Mike, who had taken over his father's position and had never stopped investigating the Henderson case. The second was Dr. Sarah Brennan, a physicist at the University of Iowa whose own family had vanished in 1991. By dawn, David had assembled a team of 6 people, all connected to the missing families in some way, all determined to uncover the truth, no matter how impossible it seemed. As they prepared to return to the mysterious center of the disappearances, David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just documenting a story. He was leading a rescue mission into the unknown. The beings had made one crucial mistake when they let him escape. They'd underestimated the power of human determination, the refusal to abandon those we love. David looked at the photograph of Tom and Martha Henderson one more time, at the dark figures lurking behind their happiness. Then he put the photo in his pocket and headed out into the Iowa morning, ready to face whatever horrors awaited in the place where families went to disappear. The final confrontation was coming, and David Chen intended to win. The team assembled at sunrise in the parking lot of Mel's Diner. their vehicles forming a small convoy in the early morning light. David studied the faces of his unlikely allies, each carrying their own burden of loss and determination. Mike Crawford, now in his 50s, had inherited more than just his father's badge. He'd inherited an obsession with the Henderson case that had defined his entire career. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd spent decades chasing ghosts. Dr. Sarah Brennan was the most surprising member of their group. A quantum physicist whose family had vanished when she was in graduate school, she'd spent the last 30 years developing theories about dimensional rifts and temporal anomalies. Her scientific mind provided a rational framework for the impossible. The others included Tom Henderson's brother Robert, who'd never stopped searching for his missing family, Maria Kowalski, daughter of the vanished Kowalski family, and James Hartwell, whose grandparents had been the first to disappear in 1983. Dolores had insisted on coming too, despite David's protests. "I've been serving coffee to broken families for 40 years, she'd said firmly. "If there's a chance to bring them home, I'm not sitting this one out." David spread a map across the hood of his car, pointing to the center of the circle formed by the missing family's farms. According to county records, this area has never been surveyed or owned. It's just listed as undeveloped territory. Dr. Brennan studied the map with scientific precision. "The electromagnetic readings I've been taking show massive anomalies in this exact location," she said. "Whatever's there, it's generating energy signatures unlike anything in our current understanding of physics." Mike Crawford checked his service weapon, though they all knew conventional firearms would be useless against beings that existed partially outside normal reality. "My father's notes mention strange reports from this area going back to the 1950s, he said. "Lights in the sky, missing time, cattle found in impossible locations. They've been here for decades," Robert Henderson said quietly. "Studying us, learning our patterns. My brother's family was just one of many experiments." As they prepared to leave, David felt the weight of the impossible photograph in his pocket. The beings knew they were coming, had probably been watching their preparations all night, but that didn't matter anymore. Too many families had suffered, too many lives had been stolen. The convoy moved slowly along increasingly remote farm roads, following Dr. Brennan's electromagnetic readings toward the center of the anomaly. The landscape grew stranger as they approached their destination. Cornfields that grew in perfect geometric patterns, trees that cast shadows in the wrong directions, and a sky that seemed somehow deeper than it should be. "We're entering the affected zone," Dr. Brennan announced over the radio. "Everyone stay close. Reality gets flexible from here on." David felt it immediately, a disorienting sensation like being underwater, where sounds were muffled and distances became uncertain. His car's GPS stopped working, the screen showing only static. They crested a small hill and saw their destination spread out below them. In the center of a perfectly circular clearing stood a structure that defied description. It wasn't quite a building and wasn't quite a machine, more like a crystalline growth that pulsed with internal light. The structure seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its edges shifting and flowing like liquid mercury. Around the central structure, David could see smaller buildings, or perhaps they were containment units. Each one glowed with the same otherworldly light he'd witnessed at the Henderson farmhouse. "Dear God," Mike Crawford whispered over the radio. "How many are there?" Dr. Brennan was taking readings with instruments David didn't recognize. "I'm counting at least 40 separate energy signatures," she reported. 40 families, trapped in temporal loops. The convoy stopped at the edge of the clearing, and the team gathered to plan their approach. But before they could formulate a strategy, the decision was made for them. 3 tall figures emerged from the central structure, moving with that same fluid grace David remembered from the farmhouse. As they approached, the air itself seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. The voice spoke inside all their heads simultaneously. "You should not have come here. David Chen, you have brought others into danger." David stepped forward, fighting against the paralyzing fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "We've come to free the families you've imprisoned." Imprisoned? The concept seemed to amuse the beings. "We have preserved them, given them eternal happiness in their final moments of joy. This is a gift beyond your comprehension." Dr. Brennan activated a device that emitted a high-pitched whine, and the beings recoiled slightly. "Temporal disruptor," she explained quickly. It should interfere with their ability to maintain the time loops. The lead being's dark eyes fixed on her with something that might have been respect. Clever. Your species occasionally produces individuals of surprising capability. Why? Robert Henderson demanded, his voice breaking with decades of suppressed grief. Why did you take them? Why my brother's family? Your emotional bonds fascinate us. The being replied. The way you sacrifice. For those you love. The pain you endure when separated. We are a dying race, unable to feel such connections. We study your preserved moments to understand what we have lost. You're killing us to learn how to live, Maria Kowalski said with disgust. Death is temporary. Love, properly preserved, is eternal. David felt anger rising in his chest, burning away the fear. You're wrong. Love isn't about preserving perfect moments. It's about growing together, changing together, facing whatever comes next together. You've turned these families into museum pieces. The being tilted its head considering this. Perhaps. But the alternative is to watch love fade as your bodies age and die. We offer immortality. We offer freedom, David countered. The freedom to choose our own fate. Dr. Brennan's device was having an effect. Around the clearing, the smaller structures were beginning to flicker, their steady glow becoming erratic. Through the wavering light, David could see shadowy figures, the trapped families becoming aware of their situation for the first time in decades. You are disrupting our collection, the being said, and for the first time, David heard something like emotion in its voice. This cannot be permitted. The three beings raised their elongated hands, and the paralyzing light began to fill the clearing. But this time, David and his team were ready. Dr. Brennan activated a second device, creating a protective field around the group. Mike Crawford and the others spread out, each carrying one of the physicist's temporal disruptors. Now! David shouted. The final battle for the souls of Iowa's missing families had begun. The clearing erupted into chaos as Dr. Brennan's temporal disruptors clashed with the being's reality-warping technology. The air itself seemed to tear and fold, creating pockets where time moved at different speeds. David watched in amazement as Mike Crawford moved in slow motion while Maria Kowalski appeared to be moving at triple speed. Stay within the protective field, Dr. Brennan shouted over the electronic whine of her devices. The temporal distortions will tear you apart if you get caught in them. The beings were clearly struggling to maintain their control. Their perfect fluid movements became jerky and uncertain as the disruptors interfered with their ability to manipulate space-time. The smaller structures around the clearing flickered more violently, and David could see the trapped families becoming more solid, more aware. Through the chaos he spotted them, the Henderson family, standing in front of what looked like a perfect recreation of their farmhouse kitchen, but now they could see beyond their eternal dinner, could see the prison they'd been trapped in for 36 years. Tom Henderson's eyes met David's across the impossible battlefield. The man's mouth moved, forming words that David couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help us. We need to get to the containment units, David yelled to his team. The families are becoming aware. This is our chance. Robert Henderson was already running toward his brother's prison, tears streaming down his face. Tom, Martha, I'm here. I never stopped looking. One of the beings intercepted him, its elongated form moving with predatory grace despite the temporal interference. But before it could reach Robert, James Hartwell tackled it from the side. The collision sent both of them tumbling through a time distortion, where they moved like figures in an old film reel, jerky, accelerated, then impossibly slow. Dr. Brennan was working frantically with her equipment, sweat beading on her forehead as she tried to maintain the protective field while simultaneously disrupting the being's technology. I can't hold this much longer, she warned. The energy requirements are enormous. David made a desperate decision. He broke from the protective field and ran toward the central structure, dodging through pockets of distorted time. In one area, he aged 10 years in a single step. In another, he moved backward through his own timeline, briefly becoming the young journalism student he'd been decades ago. The lead being intercepted him just as he reached the crystalline structure. Up close, David could see that it wasn't solid. It was made of pure energy, constantly shifting and reforming. Inside its translucent walls, he could see what looked like a vast library of human experiences, each one preserved in glowing spheres of light. You understand now, the being said, its voice echoing strangely in the temporal distortions. We are not destroyers. We are preservers. Each sphere contains a perfect moment of human love, joy, connection. Without us, these moments would be lost forever. David stared at the countless spheres, each one representing a family torn from their lives. But they're not living, he said. They're not growing, not changing, not making new memories. You've turned them into recordings? Recordings that will last forever. Your species creates beauty, then watches it die. We offer immortality. We don't want immortality, David replied. We want the chance to live. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph of Tom and Martha Henderson, the one that now showed the beings lurking behind their happiness. This is what you don't understand. The beauty isn't in the perfect moment. It's in all the imperfect moments that came before and after. The arguments and reconciliations, the fears and hopes, the way love changes and deepens over time. The being studied the photograph with those dark, hollow eyes. Your emotions are complex, contradictory. How can pain and joy exist simultaneously? Because that's what makes us human, David said. And that's what you can never preserve in your collection. Behind them, the battle was intensifying. Mike Crawford had reached the Kowalski family's containment unit and was working with one of Dr. Brennan's devices to disrupt its temporal field. The family inside, parents, 2 children, and an elderly grandmother, were becoming more solid, more real, as the loop that had held them for 45 years began to break down. But the effort was taking its toll on the rescue team. Dolores had collapsed from the strain of moving through the temporal distortions, and James Hartwell was trapped in a time pocket where he aged and de-aged in rapid cycles. Your friends are dying, the being observed. Surrender now, and we will preserve them as well. They will join our collection, forever young, forever happy. David looked at his struggling team, then back at the countless spheres of trapped families. He thought about the Henderson family, reliving their final dinner for 36 years. He thought about all the other families, frozen in their last moments of normalcy before their worlds ended. No, he said firmly. We choose to live even if it means we choose to die. The being tilted its head, genuinely puzzled. This makes no logical sense. Logic isn't everything, David replied. Sometimes you have to have faith. He raised Dr. Brennan's most powerful temporal disruptor, the one she'd warned him never to use because it was untested and potentially catastrophic. This is for every family you've stolen, every life you've frozen, every moment you've turned into a museum piece. David activated the device. The effect was immediate and devastating. The crystalline structure began to crack, its energy patterns disrupting as the disruptor interfered with the fundamental forces holding it together. The being in front of him flickered like a bad television signal, its form becoming unstable. What have you done? It demanded, its voice now filled with something David recognized as fear. I've given them a choice, David replied. Throughout the clearing, the containment units were failing. Families that had been trapped for decades were suddenly free, blinking in confusion as they found themselves in a world that had aged without them. The Henderson family stumbled out of their kitchen prison, Tom and Martha clutching their children as they tried to understand what had happened to them. But freedom came with a price. As the being's technology failed, the temporal distortions became chaotic and unpredictable. The very fabric of space-time was unraveling around them. The dimensional barriers are collapsing, Dr. Brennan screamed over the growing chaos. Everyone needs to get out of here now. The 3 beings were retreating toward their damaged structure, their forms becoming increasingly unstable. You have doomed us all, the lead being said to David. Without our technology to maintain the barriers, this reality will collapse into the void between dimensions. David felt a chill of horror as he realized what he'd done. In freeing the families, he might have destroyed everything. But then Tom Henderson was beside him, solid and real for the first time in 36 years. Thank you, the man said simply. Whatever happens next, thank you for giving us the chance to choose. Around them, other freed families were making the same choice. Instead of fleeing the collapsing reality, they were helping the rescue team, using their knowledge of the beings' technology to try to stabilize the dimensional barriers. We've been watching them for decades, Martha Henderson explained as she worked alongside Dr. Brennan. We learned how their systems work. Maybe we can fix this. The Kowalski family was helping to evacuate the injured. while the Brennans, Dr. Sarah's own family, freed after 33 years, were using their preserved knowledge to guide the others to safety. It was the most beautiful thing David had ever seen. Families that had been torn apart by alien technology, working together to save not just themselves but everyone around them. The beings had been wrong about human nature. Love wasn't something to be preserved in perfect moments. It was something that grew stronger in the face of impossible odds. As the dimensional barriers stabilized and the immediate danger passed, David looked around at the families he'd helped to free. They were older now, aged by their time in captivity, but they were alive. They were real. They had the chance to make new memories, to love and lose and hope and dream. The beings were gone, their damaged ship disappearing into whatever dimension they'd come from, but their legacy remained, not in the families they'd imprisoned, but in the strength those families had shown when given the chance to choose their own fate. David Chen had come to Iowa to document a mystery. Instead, he'd helped write the greatest rescue story in human history. The aftermath of the dimensional collapse left the clearing looking like a war zone. Where the crystalline structure had stood, there was now only a crater filled with strange, iridescent sand that seemed to shift colors in the sunlight. The smaller containment units had vanished entirely, leaving behind only circular patches of dead grass. David sat on a fallen log, his camera equipment scattered around him, trying to process what had just happened. 43 families, missing for decades, were now free. But they were also displaced in time, strangers in a world that had moved on without them. Dr. Brennan was taking readings with her surviving instruments, her face grave. "The dimensional barriers are stable for now," she reported, "but this area will never be the same. The fabric of space-time has been permanently altered." Mike Crawford was coordinating with state authorities via satellite phone, trying to explain the impossible situation. "Yes, I understand how it sounds," he was saying, "but I have 43 families here who were declared dead decades ago, and they're very much alive. The freed families were dealing with their situation in different ways. Some, like the Hendersons, were clinging to each other, overwhelmed by the reality of their freedom. Others were asking desperate questions about the world they'd missed. Wars, technological advances, the fate of loved ones who had aged while they remained frozen in time. Tom Henderson approached. David, his face showing the strain of 36 years of captivity. "My parents," he said quietly. "Are they?" David nodded sadly. "I'm sorry. They passed away in the early 2000s. They never stopped looking for you." Tom's shoulders sagged, and Martha moved to comfort him. Their children, Bobby and Sarah, were struggling with the concept that they were now younger than many of their own cousins. "What happens to us now?" Martha asked. "We don't exist in this world anymore. No social security numbers, no records, no legal identity." It was a question that would plague all the freed families. They were refugees from time itself, displaced persons in their own country. Dolores, who had recovered from her ordeal in the temporal distortions, was already thinking practically. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "This community has been broken for 40 years, waiting for you all to come home. Now that you're back, we'll find a way to make it work." Dr. Brennan was studying her readings with growing concern. "David, I need to show you something," she said, pulling him aside. "The dimensional damage isn't limited to this area. I'm detecting similar anomalies at sites around the world, places where other families have disappeared under mysterious circumstances." David felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying there are more of these beings? More imprisoned families?" "I'm saying this was just one collection site. There could be dozens, maybe hundreds of others." The weight of this revelation settled on David's shoulders like a lead blanket. The Henderson case hadn't been an isolated incident. It was part of a global phenomenon that had been going on for decades, possibly centuries. "We have to tell people," David said. "The world needs to know what's happening." "Who's going to believe us?" Dr. Brennan asked. "Even with all the evidence, even with the freed families as witnesses, this story is too impossible for most people to accept." David looked around at the families scattered across the clearing, people who had been given up for dead, now blinking in the sunlight of a world that had forgotten them. "Then we make them believe," he said. "We document everything, tell their stories, show the world that love is stronger than any technology, no matter how advanced." Over the next several hours, as government officials and scientists began arriving at the site, David conducted interviews, with the Freed families. Each story was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. The Kowalski family described decades of watching their preserved dinner grow cold, aware but unable to move or speak. The Brennans talked about the agony of seeing their children frozen at ages 7 and 9, never growing up, never experiencing life. But they also spoke of hope, the way they'd maintained their connections to each other even in captivity, the strength they'd drawn from their love for one another. "We never gave up," said Elena Kowalski, tears streaming down her face as she held her husband's hand. "Even when we couldn't move, couldn't speak, we never stopped believing that someone would find us." As the sun began to set, David found himself standing with the Henderson family at the edge of the clearing. The children were actually playing for the first time in 36 years, while Tom and Martha watched with wonder. "What will you do now?" David asked. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Learn to live again, I suppose. Figure out how to be a family in a world we don't recognize. The house is still there," Robert Henderson said, joining them. "I've been maintaining it all these years, hoping. I never gave up hope that you'd come home." Martha smiled through her tears. "Then maybe we start there. Maybe we go home and try to pick up the pieces. It won't be easy," David warned. "The world has changed. Technology, society, everything is different now. We'll adapt," Sarah Henderson said with the confidence of a teenager who had faced the impossible and survived. "We're good at that." As night fell, David began packing his equipment. His documentary about the Henderson disappearance had become something far more significant, a record of the greatest rescue mission in human history, and proof that some bonds are too strong to be broken by any force in the universe. Dr. Brennan approached him as he loaded his car. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about telling the world. I want to help." "It's going to be dangerous," David warned. "If there are more of these beings out there, they won't appreciate the exposure." "All the more reason to act quickly," she replied. "We need to find the other sites, free the other families. This can't be the end. It has to be the beginning." David nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. The Henderson case had been solved, but it had revealed a much larger mystery. Somewhere out there, other families were trapped in their final moments, waiting for someone to find them, to free them, to give them back their lives. As he drove away from the clearing, David looked in his rearview mirror and saw the freed families helping each other, supporting one another as they faced an uncertain future. They had been preserved as specimens, but they had chosen to live as human beings. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed, and he knew that no matter what dangers lay ahead, he would continue fighting to free every family that had been stolen from time itself. The Henderson case was closed, but David Chen's real work was just beginning. Chapter 10. 3 months after the dimensional collapse, David Chen stood in a television studio in Chicago, preparing for the most important interview of his career. Across from him sat Rebecca Martinez, the host of $60 Minutes, her expression skeptical but intrigued. "Dr. Chen," she began, "you're asking the American people to believe that 43 families, missing for decades, were rescued from alien captivity in rural Iowa. You understand how that sounds." David had expected this reaction. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the freed families themselves, Dr. Brennan's scientific data, the government's reluctant confirmation of the events, the story was still too incredible for many to accept. "I understand completely," David replied calmly. 6 months ago, I would have been just as skeptical, but sometimes the truth is stranger than anything we can imagine. The interview had been arranged as part of a coordinated media campaign. David, Dr. Brennan, and several of the freed families had spent weeks preparing for this moment, knowing that public awareness was their best protection against future abductions. "Let's talk about the Henderson family," Rebecca continued. "They've been living with Tom's brother Robert for the past 3 months. How are they adjusting to life in 2024? David smiled, thinking of his recent visit to the Henderson farm. "It's been challenging, but they're remarkably resilient. Bobby Henderson, who was 8 when he disappeared, is now learning to use a smartphone. Sarah is enrolled in community college, studying subjects that didn't exist when she was taken. And the parents? Tom and Martha are dealing with the grief of losing their parents while they were captive, but they're also amazed by how the world has changed. Martha told me she spent an entire day watching YouTube videos, fascinated by the idea that anyone can share their story with the world. What David didn't mention was the darker side of their adjustment. Several of the freed families were struggling with severe PTSD, haunted by decades of awareness while being unable to move or speak. The Kowalski children, now adults in bodies that had barely aged, were having difficulty forming relationships with people their apparent age. But there had been victories too. The Brennan family had been reunited with Dr. Sarah Brennan, creating a unique situation where a daughter was now older than her parents. The Hartwell grandparents had met great-grandchildren they never knew existed. Dr. Chen, you claim that this isn't an isolated incident, that there are other sites around the world where families are being held captive. David nodded gravely. Dr. Brennan's research has identified at least 12 other locations with similar electromagnetic anomalies. We believe there are hundreds, possibly thousands of families still trapped. And what are you doing about it? We're forming an international task force. Scientists, investigators, and family members of the disappeared are working together to locate and free these captives. We call it the Temporal Rescue Initiative. The interview continued for another 20 minutes with David carefully presenting the evidence while trying to maintain credibility. He knew that for every person who believed their story, 10 others would dismiss it as elaborate fiction. But the interview was just the beginning. After the show aired, David's phone didn't stop ringing. Families from around the world contacted him, sharing stories of loved ones who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. A farmer in Scotland whose entire family had, disappeared during Sunday dinner. A fishing village in Japan where 3 generations had vanished simultaneously. A suburban neighborhood in Australia where 5 families had simply ceased to exist overnight. Dr. Brennan's laboratory at the University of Iowa became the unofficial headquarters of the Temporal Rescue Initiative. Her team worked around the clock, analyzing electromagnetic data from around the globe, identifying potential sites where families might be held captive. The first international rescue mission took place 6 months after the Henderson liberation. A team of scientists and investigators traveled to a remote area of the Scottish Highlands, where the MacLeod family had disappeared in 1987. David documented the mission, his camera capturing the moment when the MacLeod family, parents, 3 children, and 2 grandparents, stumbled out of their temporal prison after 37 years of captivity. The reunion with surviving family members was both heartbreaking and beautiful, a testament to the enduring power of love across time. But not every mission was successful. Some sites had been abandoned by their alien captors, leaving behind only empty craters and the lingering scent of ozone. Others were too heavily defended, forcing the rescue teams to retreat and plan more carefully. The beings themselves remained largely invisible, but their presence was felt. Equipment would malfunction at crucial moments. Team members would experience missing time or false memories. It became clear that the aliens were adapting their tactics, learning from each rescue attempt. David's documentary about the Henderson case, titled Preserved: The Iowa Disappearances, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. But more importantly, it sparked a global conversation about the nature of consciousness, the meaning of love, and humanity's place in a universe far stranger than anyone had imagined. During his acceptance speech, David held up the photograph of Tom and Martha Henderson, the one that had started it all. "This picture taught me that love isn't about perfect moments," he said to the audience of Hollywood's elite. "It's about the choice to keep loving, even when everything seems impossible." The camera panned to the audience where Tom and Martha Henderson sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces as they applauded the man who had given them back their lives. But even as David celebrated this victory, he knew the real work was far from over. Dr. Brennan's latest research suggested that the alien collection sites were part of a vast network spanning multiple galaxies. Earth wasn't the only world being harvested for emotional experiences. The Temporal Rescue Initiative was expanding, recruiting scientists and investigators from around the world. They were developing new technologies, new strategies, new ways to fight an enemy that existed partially outside normal space-time. And somewhere out there, in hidden facilities scattered across the globe, families were still trapped in their final moments of happiness, waiting for someone to find them, to free them, to give them back their chance to live and love and grow old together. David Chen had started as a documentary filmmaker, investigating a single missing family. Now he was leading a global resistance movement against forces beyond human comprehension. The Henderson case had been solved, but the war for humanity's freedom had only just begun. As David stood on the stage holding his Oscar and looking out at an audience that included some of the families he'd helped rescue, he made a silent promise. He would continue fighting, continue searching, continue believing in the power of love to overcome any obstacle, because in the end, that's what made them human. Not their technology, not their intelligence, but their refusal to give up on each other, no matter how impossible the odds. The beings had tried to preserve perfect moments of human love. Instead, they had discovered something far more powerful, love that grows stronger in the face of adversity, love that refuses to be contained or controlled, love that chooses freedom over safety, growth over preservation. It was a lesson that would echo across the stars, carried by the families who had chosen to live rather than be preserved, who had chosen hope over despair, who had chosen each other over eternity. The Henderson family was home, but the fight for all the other families was just beginning.